considers to be, quote, appropriate. Sounds simple enough, but also applies to how often certain types of symptoms manifest themselves. But please remember one thing, there is no behavior that is universally, quote, normal. Simply because it's normal for you does not necessarily make it normal for somebody else, and vice versa. Part of the challenge deals again with the idea of how it is that those particular behaviors manifest themselves. When those behaviors are demonstrated by the majority of people, they call those things, quote, normal. But sometimes those behaviors can be rather rare. Those particular behaviors become then abnormal, as it were. There are ways to test for that sort of stuff, but it always boils down to what type of instrument you want to use and to what extent that instrument may or may not be appropriate or valid or reliable in a particular context. So again, it depends on how you look at some of those things. Some folks look at the idea of abnormal as some kind of personal suffering. What do you think about when you think about the notion of suffering? Come on, y'all can do it. Would you say that you suffer, put that in quotation marks, when things go different than how you think they're supposed to go? Does that constitute suffering or irritated? Are those different? Not even a venture of a guess. How many of you know folks who have what we would call significant emotional concerns, whatever those might be? Know anybody that's got, you don't have to raise your hand, anybody you know who has bipolar 1 in comparison to, let's say, bipolar 2? Do you know the difference? The biggest difference related to bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 is the length of time for the manic phase, or not reaching quite full criteria for the manic phase. So, okay, somebody has bipolar 1 disorder. Is their behavior normal or abnormal? I'm sorry?
I guess if they're having an episode, it would be abnormal.
Could be, depending on it depends on how they engage with the episode. One of the criteria for things like bipolar disorder would consist of things like, we call it an elevated mood. There is the potential for what they also define as risky behavior. You'll find that some folks, please hear me carefully, some people, certainly not all, but some folks, when they get into more what we would define as risky behaviors, they become sexually promiscuous. Might be one particular response to a manic phase. They want to go have the sex all the time. It doesn't make any difference with whom or with where. Sometimes they shop. I've known of folks who have shopped for that old guy who had as many as 9 full 12-place settings of china still in the boxes. What for? That's what he did when he was manic. He bought china. Did he keep it? I don't know. You'll see advertisements on television for folks who go on spending sprees, and they'll be advertising some kind of drug that helps people with their mood stabilization or whatever else. For those individuals, their behavior is normal. They think that's normal for them. For the rest of us watching that who don't behave in that way, we look at that and go, that's a little odd. Certainly at the very least, it's a little bit different than what we consider norm. We define some of those things based on different types of models. There's a biopsychosocial model, which is a big $50 word, simply says we look at biology in your context. Certain chemical issues going on in the system versus your environment. The Greek physician Hippocrates introduced the medical model and said that psychological disorders came from what he called the imbalance of 4 humors. Now, his humors had to do with things that related to the blood, which is not, we don't have to unpack all of that. But their psychological process then looks at a psychological model that would include psychocognitive differences, humanistic approaches, all kinds of different stuff. Now, the best way to look at it nowadays is to look at it from the standpoint of a diathesis stress model, which says that we've got all kinds of stuff going on. Genetics is an issue for some. Early learning experiences is also an issue for some. Biological processes, stress, all that kind of stuff can significantly contribute to what we call abnormal behavior. Now, this is somewhat disappointing. It won't be for y'all because y'all won't know the difference. All of my class information is based on the DSM-4. The DSM-4 was ruled obsolete in 2013. We used the DSM-5. So some of the information in your book is outdated. Surprise, surprise. But it boils down to there's a handful of categories. Thumb through your book and see if it makes reference to diagnoses on 5 axes or axes. In the DSM-4, we diagnosed on axis 1 for emotional issues, axis 2 for personality disorders, axis 3 for medical concerns, axis 4 for external environmental issues, and then axis 5 was what was called a GAF, or a global assessment of functioning. I'm sorry?
It doesn't go into detail.
Does it say something about 5 axes though?
DSM-5?
No, DSM-4. It should be, I'm assuming that your reference point is DSM-4.
It says 5.
Does it say 5 over there? Okay.
This was the new edition this year.
Is it 7 or 8?
This is 7.
Okay. And then there's a misprint somewhere on my side because I'm still using quote unquote the 7th edition, but my notes reference the DSM-4. So you can take part of what I said and pitch it. The notion still is that we diagnose, but not in those specific categories. They have broadened the idea of how we diagnose. And we refer to broader categories instead of pigeonholing some of those things. But the idea is to have some kind of system that we can use to some degree or other. Those systems then comprise different categories of disorders. For example, we could start with something like anxiety disorders. Now, some of y'all are going to tell me that you're anxious. Okay, you may be. But in the process of classifying some of those disorders, here comes the interesting criteria that becomes important. You may have some sort of emotional concern, but unless that emotional concern hinders your normal daily function, you're fine. You get some test anxiety? Oh, well, no worries. Does that mean you have generalized anxiety disorder? No. That just means you get anxious when you take a test. There's a difference. But they classify anxiety disorders into phobias, whether they're specific or social. You can develop conditions related to what they call agoraphobia, all kinds of fun stuff. How many of you get a little twitchy when you go to Walmart? Now, what makes you twitchy when you get to Walmart? As in too many? Or they get stupid? Stupid and too many? Okay, that's fair. Now, do you get so worked up or such a fizz that you have to leave? Maybe you need to see somebody about that. No, I don't do stupid. I don't do stupid people either. The easiest way for me to maneuver through Walmart is to go get my business done and leave right freaking now, because I don't do stupid. See, but I get frustrated because they've got all the regular check lanes all shut down and make you scan your own groceries or whatever. Even to the point that maybe I'll shop somewhere else. Does that mean I have a phobia with Walmart? No, I just mean I'm irritated. There's a difference. There are some people who get so anxious because they think other people are watching them. In fact, some of us are watching them. So then what? That some folks get so rattled that they will walk off and leave a full buggy of groceries in the middle of the store and leave because they get so concerned that someone is watching or judging them in some way. That's a condition referred to as agoraphobia. The other notion related to something, it's similar, it's called social phobia. It's when you're simply concerned that people are going to judge you simply because of who you are. Or that you get concerned about not being able to get out. You ever been into a Walmart and concerned that you cannot escape? That's not claustrophobia. It's a little difficult to get claustrophobic in a place that big. But if you get concerned about not being able to get out because something may get you, that's a different type of anxiety concern. Generalized anxiety boils down to a certain elements of anxiety over an extended amount of time, more days than not. Then it classifies in a different way. How many of you have ever had a panic attack? And I mean a full bore, as in your chest, you think your heart's going to blow out of your body. You are having a heart attack, or at least you want to think you are. You might feel like an elephant sitting on your chest. You might crack a sweat, might get nauseous, might decide you want to barf. You just never can tell. It can be all of that and some more for individuals who have that. Those symptoms are acute, meaning they come on right now, and they will subside fairly quickly if you can manage to talk yourself down a little bit. Even then, even if you're not able to talk yourself down, they won't last what we would call a terribly long time in comparison to other types of anxiety. But it meets a very specific criteria. But people who have panic attacks don't want to have them. One of the reasons they have them is that they're anxious about the fact that they might have another one, which then elevates their anxiety, which then means the possibility of another panic attack increases. So it's kind of an endless circle of getting caught in a way that you can't get out. Sometimes people take medication for those sorts of concerns. Other people don't. Again, it depends on the context. It also depends on the quality of your doctor. But again, panic disorder can be a little, disconcerting, we'll say. If you've ever had one of those, you would know. It is very, very uncomfortable. At the very least, you will feel like you're losing your mind. And for most of us, the idea of losing our minds doesn't make us feel overly well, generally speaking. How many of you know other folks who would call themselves, or maybe even you call yourself, OCD, obsessively compulsive? How many of you make lists? None of you make a list, really?
I make a list, but I'm not excessive.
Making the list doesn't mean that you're OCD. That's not, no. Making the list is not OCD. It's when you can't do anything else in life because you're busy making the freaking list. That's OCD. That's something different. My youngest child color codes lists. She'll make a list and color code that bad boy based on when she was looking for a teaching job after she graduated and passed her teaching certificate. Her list was color coded by geographical regions for the state of Texas. This color red meant she was over in this part. Green was over there, or whatever it was. But it helped her much more quickly identify who she was dealing with at a particular time. The fun part with hers in that particular context, it did not hinder her function. She just uses different color pens when she makes a list. But she makes a list by hand. She doesn't get on the computer and type up one. She prints out her list. How many of y'all write cursive versus print? How many of y'all print? Okay. She still prints. She prints her list. She draws the little box beside it so that she can check it off. The boxes will be the same color as the list writing, and she'll check off the box with the appropriate color. Does it hinder her daily function? No. She just spends too much freaking time working on a list. But she can function just fine if she needed to. I used to highlight book materials based on the color of the book cover. If the book cover was blue, I was going to underline in that book with a blue marker of some sort. My wife laughed at me. She thought that's the funniest thing ever. I finally got over that, and I used to use yellow all the time, and only yellow. Don't use anything else. Does it keep me from getting anything else done because I'm concerned about the quality of my highlighter? Sometimes. I was in Bozeman whenever I was gone, back in the middle of October. My highlighter was running dry. What do I do about that? I go buy another 5-pack. And I didn't wait till tomorrow. I stopped what I was doing, got back in the car, left the house, went to town and bought highlighters. Because I have to have a highlighter now, not tomorrow. Now, did it keep any other of my functioning from taking place? Nope. Went back home, had my dinner, everything's fine. My wife laughed at me the whole time. She said, "You went to the store to get highlight." I did. Why didn't you just wait till tomorrow? It wasn't far. It was around the corner. Literally around the corner up the street to Target to get my stuff. But obsessive compulsive concerns, where they become challenging, is when you cannot get other functioning done because you're busy with something else. I've told y'all about how wide different hallways are over here at Century City. Does that keep me from being able to walk anywhere I need to go because I'm counting the tiles? It does not. Surely none of you have ever counted tiles or ceiling tiles. None of y'all would do something like that. How many of you count steps anywhere? Y'all know how many steps it takes you to get from point A to point B in your house? How many steps? How many of you have a second floor at your house? How many steps are there?
I think 15.
You see, she thinks 15. I promise you, at my house, there's 15 going up and 15 going down every stinking time. I go up and I come back down. It's still 15 every single time. If I don't count on the way up for whatever reason, and I'm about halfway up, I can tell you what step I'm on and what's next, simply because of the amount of time it takes. Oh, I'm on number 7, and I pick up where I am, or whatever. Do I get any of my other work done? Yeah. Do I count them? Every time. Do I take a piece of medication for that? No, because it doesn't hinder anything else. Again, it's about what it is that keeps you captured. Compulsions are almost involuntary. They're behaviors that you exhibit because you're being confronted with some other sort of angst, and your behavior becomes your coping tool. People who are manic, if they become overly sexual, that's part of their coping. They feel like it helps the volume of that emotionality turn down. But it can also create just as many struggles as it helps stop. Again, it depends on the individual and what's going on. All kinds of anxiety comes up. Biological factors related to anxiety include different levels of neurotransmitters, oversensitivity related to the brainstem. Folks who have anxiety concerns will usually exaggerate the context in which they're finding themselves. They exaggerate the danger or the concern about the environment. What are some things that make you nervous? I know y'all got some nervous stuff going on. What is it? What makes you nervous? Besides somebody asking you what makes you nervous? Nothing. Y'all are all good all the way around. Then what we need to do, y'all need to tell us the rest of us about that so that we can bottle it up and sell it. And we'll all make an awful lot of money. What makes you nervous? Grades? That's reasonable. Now, what is the one thing you can do that helps lessen that anxiety related to grades? Or just do your work. It might not even be about studying. It could be just check off your box. What else? What else makes you nervous besides grades? Y'all have teachers, go back to grades. Do you have teachers that you don't know what kind of grade you're going to have till it's over with? You can calculate your grade in this class any minute of the day and know exactly where it is. Nothing to it. Do your other teachers not give you that information? You can't tell what your grades are? I would be nervous too.
My nursing, half the class you get a cumulative midterm and a cumulative final. And a few other grades, but not.
You know, there's an awful lot that goes on those two tests. But is that all you know about your other grades though? That they add up to something? Do they have a cumulative total, or are they about percentages? Do you even know? I think some of you know, you're just being shy today for some reason or another. What other concerns do folks have, generally speaking? What about them? Some of us are a little on the strange side. But what is it that makes them weird?
You don't know what they're going to do. It's going through their mind.
And why is it that you would need to know what goes through their mind? Do we need to know what's going through your mind? Do I need to know what's happening in your mind? Could I be curious about what goes on in your mind? Sure. Could I make it up? Sure. And how does that thought, if I'm going to get concerned about what you got going on in your mind, how does that thought going to benefit me in any way? How does that help me or not? If I want to know what somebody's thinking, I'll ask. And you may say, none of your business, or I don't know, which may or may not be true. You may know, but you may not be willing to tell, and that's fine too. What else is it about people that we want to know that that makes us anxious, besides the fact that they're weird? Yeah, all of y'all are weird, by the way. I'm not.
I guess some people are concerned about what other people are thinking about them, or like if they're applying for a job, if they don't get it, or.
Sure. Now, what's the first thing that goes through your mind with the comment I'm about to make? Y'all ain't that important. What's going on in your mind is not that important to anybody else. What is it about your thought that would make you think that the rest of us wanted to know about it? Is it that exciting? Good, no, yes, maybe, I don't know. Because I suppose it would depend on what it is. Does it make you normal or abnormal to have those thoughts, whatever they happen to be?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let me ask another question. I mean, since we're talking about different thoughts of what makes people go or not go, what would you consider? Now, again, I'm not asking you what you think. And just because if you decide to answer the question does not mean that you're committing that you think about things like this. But what is a thought that you would be curious to know about other folks, but certainly would not ever ask because it would be terribly uncomfortable? Y'all don't get curious about other folks? Y'all were curious about them a while ago. So why are you not so curious now? Why not? Or maybe you're right. I told you before, I haven't come up with anything that I can't ask if I don't ask it well. It's about what other people do with what I ask that becomes a bit of a challenge. But there are things about other people you want to know. It's part of the human experience to be curious about other people. What makes us human, at least to some degree. So why is it that we get so anxious about asking?
We're not sure how they're gonna react.
Could be. Don't any of you ever get curious about what everybody else does at their home when there's nobody else around? I didn't ask if you cared, I asked if you got curious. Y'all should try getting curious about things. How is it that you'll learn anything if you're not curious? What would you think is the worst possible psychological disorder to have to manage as the victim of the disorder?
Like any disorder?
Yeah, the ones that you know about, which I promise you, compared to the list, it's not going to be very many. Tourette's? Now, what type? The type where people blurt stuff out of their mouth, or just random out of their mouth, or about twitching? You can do one that doesn't have talking, but something when you don't know what's going to come out of mouth. You know, whatever it happens to be, that could be an issue. What else would be a challenge besides something like Tourette's? which is an anxiety disorder, by the way.
Can you tell me about schizophrenia? I really don't know.
What would you like to know about
Well,
schizophrenia?
like what a person would act like, what would really be.
People, the criteria for schizophrenia includes things like they see and or hear things that other people don't. Now, what prompts that is not the issue necessarily. There are 2 or 3 different types of schizophrenia. Again, it's about what they hear or see that other people don't. It can also be related to how they respond to certain difficulties. I had a conversation one time with a guy who worked for the government, which is dangerous. He worked for the post office. And he was convinced that everybody in that post office was trying to take his job away from him. And there was nobody in his office couldn't have cared less. They're not worried about his job. But he had come to think, for whatever reason, by some of their behaviors, that they were trying to take his job away from him, trying to get him fired. Becomes very paranoid. So in that context, paranoia was an issue. But if someone is dealing with schizophrenia and is catatonic, they just kind of sit there. Anybody ever been to the state hospital and seen anybody that's just, checked out? Like, whoop, have left the premises. Okay. What do you see when you see them? Anything particular?
What do you mean? What do you see?
What do they look like?
I don't know, this guy was really happy just running across the grass butt naked.
Was somebody chasing him?
No, they just let him do it. He almost reminded me of the movie with Jim Carrey where he wears the tutu and he's in the mental place.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
Literally dancing around like a fairy, just having a jolly good time.
Whatever works.
I was like, that's a happy guy.
You'll find people who, if they become catatonic, they'll just sit there. You can talk to them, they can get nothing. They'll literally, if they're catatonic, they'll just be. You can talk to them, you can put your hand in front of their face, whatever you want. I did an interview with a lady one time who I diagnosed with schizophrenia, catatonic type, that never spoke a word for the entire interview. Not one word. So how would I get information from her? Somebody was talking for her. Her daughter was with her. Then I had to make the assumption that what her daughter was telling me was right.
How did my daughter know what
That was part of the interesting piece of the interview, that I had to make a notation that says the client is catatonic and does not speak. My information comes from this person's daughter. It's as reliable as you think it is. I have no way to know if it's reliable or not.
So is there medication you can give them to snap them out?
Maybe, it depends on the person. In that particular context, it wasn't about medication. She was trying to get disability, so I'm sure she was looking for some medication. But again, the idea with schizophrenia, besides the hearing and not hearing or whatever else that other people do or don't, again, it can be related to paranoia. It can be a catatonic version. It can be persecutory, and there's a difference between paranoia and persecution. Again, that depends on how people process or perceive the information that they hear or see that's going through their head. The majority of which, by the way, will not exist. I'm not telling you that people who have schizophrenia are making stuff up. I'm not telling, in their world, it's as real as you and I. It's just that it's different than how we're processing information. Have you ever dealt with anyone who, the condition is called synesthesia. It's a condition in where people perceive stimuli differently, meaning, and the only way for me to show you is to give you an example. Someone might smell color. They might not see the color red, but they would tell you what the color red smells like because that's how they perceive it. That to me, I think, would be a really strange one to have to manage. And I don't know about medication for that. But can you imagine what it would be like to process things like color through your nose, or to taste red not be able to see it, but to taste it. People have those types of concerns. That's the very specific sort of disorder that you're not going to find in your everyday general psychology chapter, I don't imagine. Those are very specialized, very particular types of diagnostic things. But if there is any sort of physiological / psychological issue that you could come up with related to your body or your brain, there's probably a disorder related to it. Anything from sexual dysfunction to cognitive dysfunction to emotional challenges to whatever else. One of the disorders that can be most interesting to watch, if you're into that sort of thing, is what used to be called multiple personality disorder. Now it's called dissociative identity disorder. That's the person who has separate and complete personalities, as in more than one. And they present depending on what the context is or the level of stress. I had a client who had 4, and depending on what type of mood she was when she came into the office, I might get the 6-year-old who had a very specific name, who dressed a specific way. I could tell you if she was up front when she walked in my office. Instead, I'm dealing with an adult, a woman, 40-odd-year-old woman with 2 or 3 kids at home, walks in my office, and she had real short hair, but she might have it in little pigtails that poked out straight outside of her head. Oh, that's my 6-year-old. And she'd come to therapy like that. So I'd start with this one. And I would ask, now, where's Bertha? I'm looking for my client. Where's Bertha? And Bertha would come and talk to me. And the 6-year-old would sit down. There was another one that was part of her. Her name was Maisel. She was 60-odd, didn't want to do anything except drink, smoke, and screw. That's all. This lady would lose time. That's one of the things related to dissociative identity disorder. She would wake up, as it were, and be somewhere that she didn't know how she got there or what she had done on the way or how long she had been gone. She's been known to wake up outside of town. Had one lady one time with DID who woke up in a barn 15 miles down the road in her nightgown and didn't have the foggiest idea where she was, how she got there, or when she had gotten there, how long she had been gone. That disorder is kind of difficult to manage, especially if you check out, as it were, if you dissociate and are not aware of that. It's what happened to my other client. You know, she'd wake up and not know if she'd been to some bar and been screwing somebody or not. It added a little bit of extra stress to her home life, let's say. She also had a husband who didn't really understand those types of things. So again, it depends on what the issue is. Any of y'all ever watched Breaking Bad when it was on?
Yes.
Okay, you remember when, I've forgotten the character's name, but when he said that he was in the hospital and he said he had dissociated, had this dissociative fugue, and had wandered off in the desert, and they had him hospitalized. And he was talking to the psychologist, and the guy said, "You have to keep confidentiality, right?" And he said, "Yeah." So I told him that he was making it all up, which he was. And he couldn't tell anybody. So even though he was in trouble legally, he had confessed that information to the psychologist, and the psychologist couldn't tell anybody about it. So I didn't have no dissociative fugue. I'm fine. This is my name. This is what I do. Yes, you can fake some disorders to some degree. But again, it's about how you manage with those particular pieces of information. That's a good place to quit. We're all not into disorders today anyway. So ponder some curiosities about disorders. This is when you get a chance. You could have done this all along, but you have a chance to ask any sort of quote unquote crazy question that you'd be curious to know about. I probably talk to somebody who has it or deals with it to some degree or other, or is connected to someone who does have those particular concerns. You cannot come up with anything too far off the wall that cannot be discussed as a psychological issue at some level or other. related to either an individual or to somebody else, and how they deal with that type of information, how to manage it, how not to manage it, how to behave, how not to behave, what can you do, what can you not do, those sorts of things. You know, you have to go back to my client with the 4 personalities. It's probably closer to 5, but there was a male in there that she never would let me talk to. But I could I could call them by name and talk to them. Now, we visited for 7 years, and it really never got that much better. It was better than it was when it started, when I started dealing with it, but we never, see, and some disorders have to do with trauma, and DID typically, not always, but typically is somewhat trauma related. We could get to the door behind which her trauma existed, but we couldn't open the door. She wouldn't open it, and I couldn't open it for her. She had to be willing to open it for herself, and she never did open it. Another lady who was DID, this was the lady I probably mentioned who, when she was 4, 5, 6 years old, her mother would put her in a suitcase and put her under the bed. How did she cope? She went away, and another personality came to the front to manage that for her. The same thing with my other client. What was her problem? It was trauma related to sexual abuse, most likely by her uncle, if I recall correctly, that started that cycle for her. And she developed more than one personality over time to help things manage. She literally, there was a picture of her literally, and I don't have them anymore because they were on another phone, that she had on a pair of rose-colored glasses. And that was the one that was all squared away. One that was together, very well, very professionally dressed. But she looked like a retro hippie. She had these glasses leaning down on her nose like this. And the prettiest color rose in those lenses you ever saw. Very together, very professional looking, sitting beside a person who's got her mouth wide open screaming, the lady who wants to go drink beer, smoke, and screw. Had pictures of all 4 of them. Same body, same individual, different look on her face, different outfit, whatever. There are some conditions that manifest physically. Some personalities will be bruised in some way and others not. And they show up and disappear based on whichever personality presents. It's fascinating stuff, again, if you're into that sort of idea. So ponder, whatever things you can ponder related to quote unquote, we'll call it, we won't say crazy, we'll say abnormal. That's better, that's more politically correct. That are quote abnormal, and let's see what kind of trouble we can shake up out of that stuff. Even if you think it's off the wall, you can bring it, we can talk about it. Nobody's going to get hurt, it'll be fine.